Lincoln. Hello, Douglas. Thank you for being here. Thank you for speaking to us, and it's great having you here with us today.
Well, thank you. We are really appreciative to be here today and have a chance to speak to our Polish readers.
Yes, Bartek, we're very pleased by the readership we have in Poland and by the interest that they've shown and that you've shown and by asking us to come. So we're delighted to have a chance to say thank you and all our best wishes.
So mainly we'll be speaking today about your book, Old Bones, or Stare Kości. That's the Polish title. And my first question about that book is a complex one, because Old Bones is your first novel in Norze Kelly, a series that you have written 3 books so far, I think. But what was the impulse for telling this story, and why did you decide it would not be right for example, Agent Pendergast?
Well, let me answer that. But actually, before we answer that question, both Lincoln and I wanted to convey to everyone in Poland how very concerned and deeply horrified we are at what's going on in your part of the world, and how much we support the Polish people and support your resistance to this horrific attack on your neighbor. We are really concerned about that, and I know I speak for all Americans to say that we really support Poland. We know you're right on the front lines there, and so we're very, very concerned.
And your bravery is a model for everybody. Your
Thank you,
bravery and
guys.
courage.
I appreciate that a lot, and I'm sure that I'm also speaking for my fellow Polish people, that we appreciate that, and we appreciate the support of American people and people around the world, really,
Well,
at least
thank you.
Western part.
Yes. So to answer your question, this is the first book in a new series, and we both Norze Kelly and Corey Swanson appeared in the Pendergast books, but separately. They don't really know each other. And Lincoln and I were really fond of those characters. We both loved them in a way. It's Lincoln is especially fond of Norze Kelly, and I'm especially fond of Corey Swanson. And we just suddenly had this idea: why don't we launch a new series with the two of them? And that's what we did. And we're really pleased with this first book in this series. We think it's a really cool subject. It's a nonfiction subject. This is not a story we made up. It's a true. It's based on the Donner Party, which was a group of immigrants from who were going to California in 1846, and were caught in the mountains of the Sierra Mountains in a terrific snowstorm, and they were stranded in the mountains over the course of the winter, in which many of them starved to death, and the survivors ate those who died. And it's a horrific story. And so the idea that we had, which is also based on the truth, is it's based on an actual archaeological excavation of one of the Donner campsites, which has been done, where they discover a horror even worse than cannibalism. We can't say what it is because we obviously don't want to spoil the story. But anyway, so that's how it started. And sorry, Link, I should pass it over to you to talk about some of the details.
No, I think Bartek, if it's okay with you, the best way to proceed is if Doug answers a question and then I answer a question. How does that sound?
It sounds fine, but not always I will know which question is best for which one of you. But I can try.
Feel free to single out one of us.
All right. Okay, I will.
In this case, just to add to what Doug said, we really like this new series because the Pendergast books are very dark and very gothic in their feeling, and quite complicated too, in a good way, I hope. And then the Norze and Corey books are a bit more streamlined, a bit faster moving, and they're also set in a very different area in New Mexico, which Doug lives part of the year, so he can add realism to that. And it's just a nice, for us, it's refreshing to have two different series to work on. It's like having a summer job, basically, or an evening job.
The infamous story of donor parties, I think, widely known in the United States, but not so much here in Poland. So could you say why this particular event is still so potent after all those years? We can start with you, Lincoln, now.
Yes. It's one of those stories that has become part of American folklore, like the shootout at the OK Corral, because and everybody can identify with what happened. You have hundreds of people leaving the Midwest, going to find their fortunes in covered wagons with their families over the mountains, and they have very poor guides, and they don't know, they're dependent on their guides, and their guides have poor judgment, and they lead them, had it been one day earlier, they would have made it over the pass and it wouldn't have snowed, but they were stuck there for 3 months. And so the story gripped all of America, sort of like General Custer's Last Stand. It was so sensational. And one thing that made it sensational was that people were discovering the camp while the survivors were still there, and they were bringing them back to San Francisco and other places in California. And so I don't know any analogs in Poland, but I don't know, Doug has done a lot of research on the Dyatlov Pass, and it's sort of like that. It's a mystery, and it's an awful thing that happened to these families who all they wanted to do was to get over to California for a new life and farm, but they got stuck. And the thing is, there were so many instances of bravery, and not everybody would eat. Some people would rather die than cannibalize. And so there were stories of great courage and great sacrifice, and so it captured the imagination back in a time when there was no television. Basically.
And as you just said, it's a very sensational story. It's full of drama and horror, but still you decided to blend historical facts and fiction. So why was that needed, to blend fiction in?
Well, we had the idea. The donor party consisted of almost 100 people, and they were strung out when the snowstorm occurred, and it just snowed many feet, 6 or 7 meters of snow eventually. And so they were strung out, and so there were several camps, and 2 of these camps have been excavated. So what we did was we came up with the idea that there was a 3rd camp that had never been discovered, and that they finally found it. And they found it because they found the journal that's been missing for almost 200 years, the Journal of Tamsin Donner, which is known that she kept a journal, and no one's ever found it. But anyway, they find the journal, they figure out where the 3rd camp was, and they begin a very professional archaeological excavation, not expecting to find anything totally different. We're going to find the remains of eaten people, bones and broken up and chewed, all the usual archaeology of cannibalism, which exists. This isn't the only cannibal site, but instead they find something absolutely bizarre. And again, I can't say what it is, but that's where fiction comes in. And it turns out that what happened in 1846 is still relevant today. And there's a group of people who very much want to prevent this information from getting out. And that's really where the fiction part comes in.
Yeah, the way we tend to work is we try and take a real story or real scientific facts as a foundation for our books. In this case, the Donner Party, is factual. We then figure out what fictional elements we think are most interesting or would make the best story, and we subtly add those and add more and more of those to make sure that the reader's suspension of disbelief is maintained, and we carry them along as they move farther from fact and farther into fiction.
And I think that might be a great moment to ask the first question from a reader. Yavka is asking, what did you find the most surprising during your research for Old Bonds?
Well, what was really most surprising to me was the firsthand accounts, really delving into those firsthand accounts of the rescuers who came across the first people to arrive after they've been stranded for months in the snow, came across scenes of horror that I can't, it's almost, you can't even put them into words, what they found. And it sort of turned the whole, we Americans tell this heroic story about ourselves, that we went across the continent, that we went to California, they found gold. It was, this is a heroic story that we like to tell ourselves. It's one of our American myths. But this is that American myth turned upside down into absolute horror. And it's really an indication of how far human beings can sink into horror and just basic survival, even below the level of animals. That really shocked me, and I'm not easily shocked.
And I have to admit that I like the way you flesh out your characters, and Nora and Corey is one thing, but I have to say, at least up to a certain point, I developed liking for Clint Benton, who is in the first scene in the novel that he appears. He's almost like Indiana Jones. So, what can you say about him without, not revealing too much?
He was a fun character for us to write because he had to play many roles in the book. We already had the two heroines. One was the archaeologist, one worked for the government, the police. And he was like the person who we needed to jumpstart everything. We start with a clear pond and the pebble gets dropped into it. And he was the one who found these journals. And Doug, correct me if I'm wrong, but those journals really existed, right?
They did, yeah, they existed, and they're still looking for them. Of course, they find them in our book, but but they're still lost in reality.
So we took a liberty there by having him find them, and so that gives him a reason to go along on this expedition, and that gives him a reason to hire Nora. And then when they find evidence of new crimes, that brings in Corey. And so we got a lot of room to play with him as Indiana Jones, as you say, but also as a kind of a somewhat softer, more intellectual figure at times too. So we had a lot of fun playing with him as a cliche and playing with him against type, as we can't talk about too much,
Sure.
just because we don't want to spoil the ending. But we're very pleased you liked him, because that means that we made him work. We made successful. Not always are our secondary characters that memorable. What you have to make sure that each new book, you find out new things for them, new interests, new likes, things the reader can latch on to and understand. And you cannot let it become rote, the same thing. It has to always be fresh, at least for Doug and I, and that's one reason why it's nice to have two authors. He can tell me if I'm sliding into cliche or something trite or done before, and I can tell him the same thing.
As you have highlighted many times before, Nora is not the only protagonist of the novel, as the investigation led by Corey Swanson takes up a large part of the plot. So why did you decide to include her in Norze Kelly series?
Well, we thought that they'd make an interesting pair. You know, they're quite different from each other. And of course, you know, sometimes they don't get along very well. I mean, Corey is a brand new FBI agent. She's very insecure. She's on the FBI probationary period, which is the first 2 years of work, where she's being supervised by a senior partner. So she's very insecure, and she's trying to establish her authority over Nora. Well, Nora doesn't want this young whippersnapper to establish any authority over her. So the two of them are really at odds at times. But at the same time, they're both very intelligent, very strong-willed women, and they have to respect each other's intelligence. They're not, you know, they don't dislike each other. They just don't quite see eye to eye. But there is respect there. And we thought the other thing is that Nora is an archaeologist. She's good at digging up bones. Corey's specialty is in forensic anthropology, which is a discipline where, let's say, if you find a murder victim who's been there for a while and it's just a skeleton, a forensic anthropologist can take the skull, bring it back to the lab, put on clay to flesh out the face, and then reconstruct what that person looked like. And that's a very important thing. That's what Corey's able to do. She's also able to say if male or female, what kind of genetic background the person has, how old they are, and so forth. How they might have died, are there broken bones, are they healed? She's able to tell a whole bunch from the skeleton. So the two of them complement each other. Nora's able to dig the bones up, and then Corey's able to look at them and tell exactly what they are, who they are from.
And on a more basic level, for our books, we couldn't just have an archaeologist. You know, she had to find, for a thriller, she had to find murders or crimes or things. So we also had to have a crime solver, an FBI agent. And on the same token, we had to make sure if Corey, as the authority figure, found a mystery, she needed to have Nora and her expertise to solve it. So really, they both are required in the story. And even though we call it Norze Kelly book because she's been around much longer in the Pendergast books, it really involves both women as co-heroines.
I have another question from a reader that I really like, and it's asked by Agnieszka Żelazna. And she asks, do you think that women are still discriminated in professions traditionally seen as masculine? You actually write about it in the book when you write about Corey and her relations with her colleagues and other professionals from the police. So what do you think?
Unfortunately, it is very true. Wouldn't you say, Doug?
Yes, I think it's especially true in Corey's case with the FBI. Now, the FBI is trying to bring in more women agents. They've been successful doing it, but there's still kind of a macho, good old boy feeling in the FBI in some areas, and Corey runs into that. And in Old Bones, sometimes pretty dramatically, because Corey doesn't take shit from anybody. You know, she's not going to let some guy walk all over her and tell her to do this and that. There's maybe less of a discrimination against women in archaeology because now in the United States, I'd say half the archaeologists at least are women. So that's a profession that's opened up nicely to women. But law enforcement, FBI, still their problems.
And can you give us any insight into your writing process? I mean, writing on your own is definitely not an easy task, and I guess writing together poses some new challenges.
It does, and that's probably the question that people have most often because it's very foreign to the usual writing style. But what we do now is changed over the years. It's been a very organic process. But what we do now is we get an idea germ. One thing we have is many ideas. We don't have a problem coming up with ideas. We read scientific journals, or in the case of Pendergast, he now has so many sub-characters floating around his universe. We can always pick one of those out. And then we get the idea and we make sure that 18 months from now, it'll still be topical and interesting and nobody else will have stolen it or, and once we are sure we have a good idea, we start fleshing it out because, the best kind of novel is the one where as you're reading it, it seems like everything has to happen that way. The hero is forced to go right down the road because the bad guys are coming this way. And that leads him to this castle. But, we make sure he's at the castle because something happens there that has to happen. So it's our job to make everything in the novel seem seamless, as if it had to work out that way. So we have to do a lot of thinking behind the scenes of how to, sculpt this thing so that everything fits. And once that's done, we then divide the chapters between us. And that's probably where your readers and listeners will be most interested, because a lot of people think that Doug writes chapter 1, I write chapter 2, he writes 3, so on. That wouldn't work. It would be too fragmented, and it would feel too jerky, I think. So what we do is we assign each other certain characters or certain sequences. Like Doug will write a sequence in Old Bones, for example. He'll write a sequence of a chase in the snow, and that takes over 4 or 5 chapters, And I might write a sequence of Corey talking to the brother of the woman who went, was missing, and that takes 4 or 5 chapters. So we each have a specialty, and then we read each other's writing and give credit, give advice. And at first that was very difficult, having somebody else say your work sucks, you got to do this, do that. But we both respect each other, and we realize that if we let our egos get in the way, it's gonna break up immediately. So we revise our work, whether the other person revise our work, and then we send it in so that our editor revise it. And the funny thing, Bartek, is that we've learned, because we also write novels on our own, not very often, but occasionally, and we've learned that, ironically, doing that is a very lonely job, because now that we've gotten used to having a writing partner where we can get stuck and call him up and say, hey, Doug, I don't know what to do here, or this seems like it's a weak plot thread, and he can give me an idea, or vice versa. And when you're writing by yourself, it's a very lonely job, and you don't really realize that until you share the experience with somebody else. So in some ways, it's easier rather than harder.
You've been writing together for so long, and you are very prolific, I would say. So how do you make this professional collaboration fresh after all those years? Is there any magic recipe?
Well, it is very important to keep it fresh, because I'm sure we're all familiar with the writers who have written wonderful books when they were younger, and then they kind of fall into a rut, and you feel like it's just become formulaic. Lincoln and I have a mortal fear of falling into a rut like that. And so as soon as we find ourselves getting a little bored or tired with a character, well, we move on to something else. And that's one of the reasons why we launched this new series with Corey and Nora, because we thought, here are two wonderful characters. They've only been minor characters in the books. Now we can make them major characters, and we can start with a whole fresh series that is not involving the kind of cases that Pendergast works on, but involving cases of archaeology and forensic anthropology and treasure. For example, the next one in the series, called The Scorpion's Tale, involves a very famous treasure in New Mexico that is really a mystery. It's a huge mystery even today. And so we sort of riffed on that to create a novel. So we're having a lot of fun with this series. It feels very fresh to us.
Another reader, Eva 90, she or he, I don't know, asked about the personal level of your writing. I'm sure that throughout the years you have learned a great deal about yourselves. What do you find the most annoying about each other, and what do you admire the most?
What do we find most annoying about each other?
Well, I get to answer that one. You answer the last one.
You go first, Lincoln, and then I'll come back at you.
No, you can't say anything. Well, I'm a very cautious person in a lot of ways. I used to be an editor at a publishing house, and so I saw things go wrong with books many times. You know, lawsuits, or the book fell apart, and the arguments between the editor and the author. So I'm cautious, and Doug is impulsive. And if something bad happens, I'm just making this up. Let's say, I don't even want to guess, but Doug's reaction might be, okay, great, this is good publicity for us. There is somebody out there named Corey Swanson who lives a block away from me, and she's done this and that and everything else, and now she's suing me, and this is great. And I would think, no, it's not good. And he would say, in the next book, let's make her the real hero, and I'll put her right next door, and then to sue me for more money, and it'll get on the front page. And and I'll say, no, there is such a thing as bad publicity. So I would say that's not a defect in Doug, but that's just a character difference that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it is true that Link is very, very cautious, and he's not a traveler, or he doesn't really like to travel. And I go travel all over the world, and I do crazy things and climb mountains and, get myself into trouble. Like I'll give you an example of something that really horrified Lincoln. We wrote a book involving Hart Island called Gideon's Sword. It was a novel some years ago. Hart Island is an uninhabited island off of New York City in Long Island Sound, where 3 million people are buried. It's the largest potter's field in the world. It's where, since the Civil War, all the poor people who died in New York City were buried on this island. It is absolutely off limits to the general public, and the burials are conducted by convicted murderers from Rikers Island. So they bring them over in a boat, and they bury these people in mass graves.
And Rikers Island is a prison, by the way. So they have prisoners burying these.
Prisons. So I thought, this island was a setting in one of our novels, in Gideon's Sword, a very important setting. And I thought, one of us has to go there and see what it's like. We just can't make this up. One of the important things about our books are that these settings are real. We've been there. We don't want to foist off on our readers stuff that we just make up. So I rented a little boat in City Island, New York, and my wife and I went over to Rikers Island, to Hart Island. She's a professional photographer, and we thought we could sneak onto the island, take pictures, and leave. Well, we got caught by the police. We were arrested. And oh my God, I thought we were in so much trouble, but I managed to talk our way out of it. I said I was a tourist visiting from New Mexico. I didn't know anything. I didn't see the 100-foot sign that says, "Warning, do not land." And so they finally let us go. Lincoln was so mad at me. He said, "My God, you could have been put in jail." He was really upset. So that's sort of but the novel was immeasurably enriched by me having gone, and my wife took all these pictures, and the cops said, "You have to erase those pictures." So she pretended on her camera to erase the pictures, but she didn't. She made it look like she was, but they didn't know. She had this really nice Nikon camera. So anyway, so we had pictures, we had everything we needed to make a fabulously realistic scene and setting for that novel, Gideon's Sword. But Lincoln was mad at me for months afterwards for doing that.
Well, because of two things. He asked me to go first. He said, "Come with me. We'll rent a boat." And I said, NFW. If you know that acronym. So he went over there anyway. And then he called me up later that day and said, "Link, come bail me out of jail. I'm in the Bronx," as a joke. And then after he was supposed to erase the photographs, he went and posted them on our website. I said, "Don't do that." But he did it anyway. So that's, each of us has our own peculiarities. And it spills over into the writing too. But there's, I have to say I respect the hell out of Doug, and I can't imagine anybody else I could write with. We have so much in common that the things that we have in common far, out distance the personal ticks and blemishes and flaws that Doug has, which are legion, by the way.
I have to say, it's kind of funny. People ask us, "Well, how do you guys write books together when you live thousands of miles apart?" And you know what? When Lincoln and I get together, nothing gets done. We sit around, we break open a bottle of single malt scotch, we have a drink, we have another drink, we start talking about what fine fellows we are, what geniuses, and we start complaining about everything, about our agent, about our publisher, about our editor, and no work gets done. So the only way we can work is if we separate ourselves. So even before the internet, we were working together 1,000 miles apart. Actually, I lived in Europe for 4 years, and we used to call each other on our computer directly. We used to use those old modems, and I'd call his computer and then download or upload files. And then when the internet came, that was fantastic. We made it much easier for us. But I lived in Italy, and that worked well because I worked during the day and Lincoln works at night. So we found ourselves, when I was in Italy, working at the same time.
To be completely honest, it's sometimes really difficult to categorize your books, I would say, to assign them to a particular genre, as as they mix very realistic depictions of scientific research, historical facts, investigative thriller, and even horror. But what is your own perspective on your writing? Do you think in this way about what you write, that this is horror, this is thriller, this is adventure, this is action, this is something else?
Doug and I both read a lot of the same kinds of books growing up. We read a lot of 19th century English novels by Dickens and other people. We read a lot of science fiction, a lot of horror. I read a lot of H.P. Lovecraft and Poe, and also thriller writers, British writers like Geoffrey Household, or more recently, the American writer Michael Crichton, who's dead now. And I think it's Michael Crichton that our books are closest to, because when we first started writing together, we had two big problems. One was there were two of us, and they were thinking, should we call this guy Lincoln Preston? Or, what? Because people aren't going to buy a novel by two people. And the other problem was, what do we call this book? Relic, which was our first book. And we said, call it a techno thriller, because it's got a lot of technology in it. It's a thriller. There are elements of horror, and sometimes, not always, there are elements of the police procedural, the mystery, murder mystery, and elements of the supernatural or science fiction. But 99% of the time, those things that are very outre or strange, we give a scientific explanation for at the end. So it's really hard to categorize our books in any one genre. And we couldn't even categorize all our books in the same genre, but we pull in from a variety of different authors and resources and influences to create what I hope will be known to scholars and for centuries as the Preston and Child genre, to be studied and written about for centuries.
So, as you said, your books they often deal with technology. So, can we think about them as cautionary tales of sorts, as Michael Crichton's books, for example, are?
Very much so. Yes, some of the books are more cautionary tales than others. Old Bones deals with a medical issue, which I can't mention because that spoils the book, but it deals with a really interesting, extremely frightening medical and biological issue that only recently has come to the notice of medicine. And there was a Nobel Prize awarded for it not long ago for the discovery of this particular frightening aspect of biology. And so yes, that's a cautionary tale. It's also about the weaponization of that medical situation, which again, we're dealing with. We are on the verge of. It's not just nuclear weapons, but we're also, biological weapons are pretty terrifying, and we can now create artificial viruses that could literally destroy humanity in the hands of the wrong people. And we see that the world is full of countries being led by the wrong people. And so, yes, there are many cautionary tales in our novels. I know, for example, that Mount Dragon, our novel, dealt with a virus that was being weaponized that could potentially wipe out the human race.
And on a different subject, our newest Norze Kelly book, which I hope comes to Poland soon, called Diablo Mesa, deals with extraterrestrials in a very cautionary way, not in the way that the movie Alien does, but in a lot more of a intellectual way. So yes, our books are often cautionary tales as well as entertainment.
In a minute, I will ask you about Norze Kelly's books that haven't been published in Poland yet, but I have another question from a reader, Renia1473. Is there any mystery from the past that you would like to write about in the future?
Well, there is a mystery. Should I mention you mentioned Dyatlov Pass. Mm-hmm. I recently, this is a mystery that took place in Russia in 1959, and I recently wrote an article about it for the New Yorker before Russia attacked Ukraine. This has nothing to do with, it goes way back to the Soviet era, but it's a profoundly interesting mystery, profoundly interesting and really bizarre. And my article explored the nonfiction aspects of it, some of the theories that have been proposed. But I think one of our novels in the future is going to address that whole issue. Now that I've got this ton of information about it, I think it's going to be really interesting to fictionalize it. So the way we'll do it, the novel's not going to be set in Russia. It's going to be set in Colorado, in the mountains of Colorado. We're going to move all that mystery into Colorado. We're going to fictionalize it. We're going to change it around. But I think that we can build a really fabulous story on that.
And as we have obviously written 2 more Norze Kelly books that I haven't read yet, and they haven't been published in Poland yet. So can you say if they are also deeply rooted in historical events? And if so, can you give us something, to chew on until they will be published in Poland?
Of course. We're not privy to the negotiations of when things are get published. That's all up to our publisher and our agent. But we certainly are pushing for wider audiences in places like Poland, where we know we have such a strong group of interested readers, and so we hope it's very soon. We can give you a brief description of the 2 books. The first one is called The Scorpion's Tale in English, and it deals with a mysterious treasure that has actually existed, called the Victoria Peak treasure, and is on an army base in Nevada. And again, there are problems with dead bodies, and Nora and Corey have to investigate, and it involves some bad elements in the military who are involved in the treasure. And the most recent book, Diablo Mesa, involves an incident called the Roswell incident, which is known to Americans as the first time supposedly an extraterrestrial crashed near Roswell, New Mexico, in, I think, 1947. And supposedly it was known and it was described, and then the military walked it back. They said, no, it didn't happen. And so in that book, we have a multi-billionaire who's going to pay for, once and for all, a big excavation of that area. And this mushrooms into a big plot involving nuclear espionage after World War II, during the Cold War, and Area 51 and all that kind of stuff. And it ends with a cautionary tale I told you about, where when it comes to meeting people from a different world, as the expression goes, be careful what you ask for, you might get it. So those are the 2 books, and they follow very much along the lines of what you've read, in terms of Nora and Corey both taking big roles, Skip taking a large role, and Corey's boss taking a large role, and Nora's annoying new boss and bosses. We try and bring their lives along with them as the story progresses. So we're going to talk to our agent and ask when those books are going to be published in Poland, because we want to see our readers there happy and grow.
Hopefully soon, but the first step has already been made. So,
and we're so happy about that.
And the final question from Alexandra: do you plan, after Norze Kelly novels, to write about any other secondary characters from Pendergast series, maybe about enigmatic Constance Green that I find fascinating as Agent Pendergast?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because we're working right now on the next Pendergast book, where Constance Green becomes really a main character, if not the main character. It is a sequel to our previous book, Bloodless, and where I really can't go into much detail because I don't want to spoil it, but she really takes front and center in this story. And so if you like Constance Green, you're going to love this book. It's called The Cabinet of Dr. Leng.
I want to assure your reader with that question that I personally have a soft spot in my heart for Constance Green. And so if I have anything to say about it, she'll always have a major part in the Pendergast books, if not in her own, perhaps down the road. But anything is possible. Because, Doug and I want to thank you and your readers, because if it wasn't for you and your interest in our books, we wouldn't be able to do this. We wouldn't have the wherewithal to write. And the time to plan out more stories. So it's people like Polish readers and enthusiastic readers that really allow us to write these stories, and people like you who can bring us to them and answer their questions. So Bartek, we really appreciate your time and patience putting this together, and we thank the people of Poland not only for their courage at a time like this, but also on a more selfish level for their interest in our books.
Thank you, and I appreciate that a lot, and I hope that between next books you will find some time to come to Poland maybe and to meet with me and your readers in person. I'm sure that everybody here would love that, including me, of course.
Well, we would love to, Bartek. That would be great. It'd be really fascinating.
Yes, my daughter was there recently. She studied abroad in Hungary for a while, and she said Poland was the most beautiful place she visited while she was there. So we'd love to come and see you. Thank you.
So thank you very much for your time, Lincoln. Douglas, it's been a pleasure to speak to you. And Old Bones or Stare Kości out now in Poland. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.